Today's daf is Kuf Tes 109. We'll start on Kuf Ches Amid Beis with V'eno Chayev Ad Sheyale, which is a quote from the Mishnah, which is approximately, I would say, about 14 lines up from the bottom of Kuf Ches Amid Beis. You'll see the two dots. And right before Omar of Huna, the Gemara just quotes a little bit of a snippet from the Mishnah, Ve'eno chayev ad sheyale. So again, we're talking about the Iser Kares of Halah, which means that you take the carbon outside the Beis Hamikdash and you burn it on an altar. And that burning, in terms of where it has to be in order to generate an Inkarachiv Kares, is a machlokas tanoim. And according to Rabbi Yossi, it has to be on an altar, mamash a mizbeach, and we'll have to see what constitutes a mizbeach. But it can't be on a stone or on some other surface. And Reb Shimon says no. Even if he's makriv bachutz on a stone, he's still going to be chayiv. So the Gemara says, "Amar Rav Huna, my time with Rabbi Yossi, d'chsiv vayiva Noach mizbeach Hashem." So even Noach, when he built an altar, it had to be a mizbeach, and we're going to derive from that pasuk that the Torah wants to go out of his way to tell us that there's no such thing as a hakrava, and we're not talking about in the Beis Hamikdash. There was no Beis Hamikdash, obviously, without a mizbeach. So that Noach didn't just take a rock, put it down, and sacrifice something on the rock. He had to build a mizbeach. Rabbi Yochanan, my time to Reb Shimon. Where did Reb Shimon find the source for the fact that Hakrova Bachutz or Halah Bachutz doesn't have to be on a Mizbech, it could be even on a rock. Tichsiv, and now we go to a person by the name of Manoach in Tanakh, who is considered a great scholar and a great tzaddik. Vayikach Manoach es Gidiyah Ha'izim v'Samincha vayal al Hatzur Lashem. The word Tzur means a stone. So Manoach took a stone, and on the stone he brought a Gedi Izim, which is like a young goat, and a mincha, and that's who he was marked of it. And apparently, if a rock or a stone could serve as a substitute for an altar from his bath, then in the case of Allah's chutz, that's considered Allah on a rock. Even though you sacrificed it not on an altar but on a rock, you don't need a mizbeach. Ve'idach nami, v'aksiv even mizbeach. What are we going to do according to Rabbi Shimon with the pasuk of Noach? Why did Noach take the effort of building a mizbeach? Why didn't he just sacrifice it on a stone? Hahu govha bi'alma. When the Torah says that Noach took an altar, it didn't really mean that he had to take an altar and set up a mizbeach. He didn't want to he didn't want to bend down and crouch on a stone in order to do the entire avoda. He wanted something begova, something a little bit higher. Let's say chest level, neck level, eye level. So therefore, he built something of an altar. Maybe he piled one stone on top of another stone, on top of another stone, created a roof on the top, and he was makriv of it, but not because he had no other choice. But this was the most convenient way of being makriv, so he wouldn't have to crouch down on the floor. The idach nami haksiv vayikach Manoach. Why did Manoach be makriv this gedi izim and the mincha on a tzur, on a stone? I mean, obviously the hakrova was valid, and you see clearly that there's no need for a mizbeach, and that's a kasha on Rabbi Yossi. And the answer is Hora Shahav. In general, there was no permissibility, according to Rabbi Yossi, there's no permissibility to bring a carbon on a stone. But in that case of Manoach, it was a very, very unusual set of circumstances. And, there was a visit by a Malach Hashem who came to Manoach, from this is, we get Shimshon Akiva and everything else. And the Malach said, this is what you have to do. And it's a Rosh Shah. Now, honestly, I have a problem with this concept of Horosh Shah because we have a principle that goes lo b'shamayim, that an angel and not even a divine command could change the law of the Torah or a paskin a shayla. So I don't know exactly how this hakrava would be valid according to Rabbi Yossi simply because of Horosh Shah. So who cares if the Malach told him that this is what he has to do? And he could use a tzur for instead of a mizbeach. I don't know why the malach has the authority to change the law. That I don't know. Ibais ema. Now we're going back to Reb Shimon again, right? Reb Shimon was the one who said that you could be makriv anywhere, even on a stone. And now the Gemara wants to give another explanation for what underlies the reasoning that led Rabbi Shimon to that conclusion. It wasn't based on Manoach, but rather, Kedesanya, Rabbi Shimon Omer Mizbeach Pesach Oel Moed, V'ein Mizbeach Bebama. Lefichach, Hela al Hasela or al Even, Chayev. The Torah speaks about bringing a carbon bepesach oel moed. And in that context, when the Torah commands us to bring a carbon bepesach oel moed, it uses the term mizbeach. Now, why did the Torah have to go out of its way to point out that the carbon is brought b'mizbeach when it's a carbon that's brought kedasu kedin in the Kodesh, in the Ol Moed? The answer is it wants to tell you, as a mute, that there are other situations in which you don't need a Mizbeach. Here, in a Pesach Ol Moed situation, where the carbon is being brought in the Mikdash, you need a Mizbeach. You can't be makriv a carbon on a stone. But the Torah is, by inference, telling us that there is a scenario, a situation outside the Mizbeach, where you could be makriv on a stone. A sela or an even. A sela is a larger stone. And that is bibama. Bibama means outside the environs of the Mishkan or the Mikdash. So I don't get it. It says over here that ein mizbeach bibama, which means that if you were makriv in a bama, you don't need a mizbeach. So therefore, it should say lefichach, if you're makriv on a sela or an even, yatza, you fulfilled your obligation. So a man takes upon himself a pledge to bring a carbon on a bama during the time of heter bamos. Tell me that he could fulfill his obligation. We'll give him a check off if he brings the carbon on an even or a sela. So why do you say chayav? That is if he violated something. So the answer is, here's how you have to read the Brayso. Since you could be yotze, you can fulfill your obligation and discharge your promise and your duty to bring a carbon in a bama on a sela or an even. Therefore, if you do it bachutz, in a way that you're not allowed to bring the carbon, then you could do that violation and implement that avera even if you were makriv on a stone or on a rock. And this is based on the principle that you're chayav for halah in a situation where, had you done it properly, you would have been makriv a carbon, and it would have been a valid carbon. Okay. Now, according to Rabbi Yossi, going back to Rabbi Yossi again, the Bama requires that you build a Mizbeach. Boy Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. According to Rabbi Yossi, we have the following suffix. Keren v'kevesh v'yisod v'ribua. There are four parts of the Mizbeach. One is called the Keren, which we said there are four chronos on the horns of the four corners of the Gag of the Mizbeach. Then we have the Kevesh, which is the ramp that leads you up to the top of the Mizbeach with 10 amas high. Yisod is the base of the Mizbeach, where they did the Shvicha Shirayim. And Ribua, the shape of the Mizbeach has to be absolutely square. Maushi akfu b'bama. When it was man heter bamos, for example, during Novigivon, after the destruction of Shiloh, and these were periods of time where you were allowed to bring a carbon on your own personal backyard, homemade altar. Did you have to have a kevesh, a yesod? Did you have to have chronos and a ribua? Were all these requirements? Because again, this question is only going to Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi says that in a bama situation you require a mizbeach. So we want to know now if all the requirements of mizbeach apply to a bama in Rabbi Yossi's frame of reference. Omer Rabbi Yirmiyah, Tanya, we learned in a brisa. Keren v'kevesh v'ribua v'yisod ma'akvim b'bama gdola v'ma'akvim b'katana. A bama gdola is the Beis Hamikdash, or Mishkan Shiloh, or the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu in the Midbar. Those are called Bama Gedola. And in those Bamos, which are called Bamas Gedolos, which are otherwise known as Mikdashos, or Migdash, there the Torah has these four requirements. But the Brisa states that in the case of a Bama Ketana, which means a private altar that you set up and you erect in your backyard, none of these requirements apply. Okay, then now we start today's daf, which is the Mishnah on daf Kuf Tes. The Mishnah says the following. When are you chayev for halah b'chutz? Echad kodshim ksherim. We understand that if the carbon was kosher and you could have brought it inside the mikdash and instead you took it out, you're chayev. Well, what about a case of a carbon that's possible? That's the subject of this Mishnah. Are you chayev for halas chutz if you were makriv outside the mikdash, that which was possible anyway, and the carbon could not have been brought in a valid way inside the mikdash? And the Mishnah says echad kodshim psulim, but the Mishnah is going to make a qualification. So you're chayev for kodshim psulim. And in the Mishnah, we're going to have a whole list of kodshim psulim, of disqualified kodshim. And you're chayev for halah b'chutz, that you took the basar of the kodesh, that was possible, and you sacrifice, you makriv it on an altar, according to Rabbi Yossi, or on a stone, according to Rabbi Shimon, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, and you're chayev. But it's got to be shahaya psulan b'kodesh. V'kriva b'chutz chayev. So what is this qualification called? Shahaya psulan b'kodesh. And that means that it wasn't initially possible, it became possible. Like, let's say, for example, we're going to have a case where the shechita was done, with a machshav of chutzim zman or chutzim komo, right? So initially, the carbon was kosher. And that's called, in the language of the Mishnah, psulam b'kodesh. In the kodesh, it became possible during the avodah. Okay, fine. Now, again, we're going back to Allah's chutz and the chiv karis thereof, and that's the subject of this Mishnah. Hamala kizayis, etc., etc., chayev. Now, what's going on over here, just by way of introduction, is that the minimum volume of basar from the carbon that you chayev for in Allah's chutz has got to be a kizayis. But what happens if you need to add A plus B in order to achieve a volume of kizayis? Do we integrate the two halves to make up a whole of kizayis, and therefore you're chayev, or not? So the Mishnah first picks up the case of a carbon ola. Now, what's unique about a carbon ola in the matrix of carbonos is that not only are the emurim, which are designated for Haktorah al Gavi Mizbech, should be burnt on the Mizbech, but even the basar, which in other karbanos would be eaten by Zichrei Kuna or by even non-Kohanim, the basar of Ola likewise has to be burnt on the Mizbech. And that's because the nature of Ola and its definition is kulo kolil. It's completely burnt on the Mizbech. And therefore, if you do Allah b'chutz of a kizayis that's made up of two elements, it's a combination of both the basar and the emurim, yechayev, because those are the two elements that integrate to form the haktorah of an ola. It's both basar and emurim, and therefore it's a natural chibur, a natural integration, natural connection. Okay. Now, Tan Rabbana, we learned in a brisa. The brisa is going to look for a makar in the Torah for these halachas that were formulated in the Mishnah. Asher yale ola, right? When the Torah in the parsha of Halas Chutz says Yechayiv Karis because you brought it outside the Mikdash, it says ola. Okay, that's the ola. Ainli ella ola, minayin l'rabos emurei asham. Right, the emurim of an asham have to be burnt on the mizbeach, and instead he took the emurim outside the Mikdash and he burnt it on his own personal mizbeach, and he's chayv Halas Chutz. Ve'emurei chatos. Same thing applies to a chatos. Same murei kochi kochim. And all kochi kochim. Now, why does he have to add kochi kochim when he just spoke about ola and asham and chatos? The answer is that there is an entity in the constellation of karbanos where a shlomim is called kochi kochim, and that's what's called kivsei atzeres. So they brought seven sheep on the atzeres, and it was a korban shlamim, but it had the status of kochi kochim. Ve'muri kochim kalim. Now, in the case of kochi kalim, you have the basar, which is eaten by even a Yisrael, like in the case of shlamim, but you also have the emurim that have to be burnt on the mizbeach. Now he takes the emurim of shlamim outside the mizbeach, and he was mocked. He burns it on his own personal altar. So what's the ribui in the pasuk when the pasuk says ola? And the answer is Talmud Lomer zevach. Right? The pasuk adds the word zevach, which refers to any animal that you bring as a carbon, including chatas, including asham, including shlamim, the whole gamut. So let me read the pasuk. It's in Vayikra Yud Zayin. Aleim Tomer ish mi beis Yisrael min ager asher fine. Asher yala ola o zevach. So Torah adds the two words o zevach to include chatas asham and kochim kal. Minayin l'rabos hakomitz v'alavona. Now we get into menachos. Menachos is not called a zevach. A zevach only refers to an animal. So how do we know that in the case of komitz and lavona, every korban mincha has to be subject to kmitza and then to lavona? How do we know that if he brings the komitz or the lavona up bachutz on his own personal mizbech, how do we know he's chayv alos chutz? Okay, now we're beginning a long list. And the punchline of this long list, so we don't lose focus, is that he's chayav, and we need a pasuk for that. But what are the cases that we want to prove and derive from scripture that you're chayav on? Number one, kometz and levana. Number two, ktores. So he brought the ktores outside the mikdash, and he burnt the ktores on a stone, according to Rav Shimon, or dafka on an altar, according to Rav Yossi Minchas Kohanim. Now, Minchas Kohanim is very interesting because in the other cases of menachos, your stam mincha, then the after the kmitza, the shirayim is eaten. But minchas kohanim there's no achila. It's all burnt on the mizbech. Uminchas kohen mashiach, and the same is true for the carbon, the daily carbon, which is called chavitim of Kohen Gadol that he brings on every day. And we're talking about a mincha that's burnt on the mizbeach, together with an accompaniment of shemen. Hamanasech. Now, in Nisuch HaYayin, there's a shear, a minimum volume of 3 lugim. Now, I used to know how much a lug is, but unfortunately, he doesn't tell you here. Okay. A lug is made up of 12 parts, but I forgot what the smaller parts are. Anyway, so now, instead of being menasech the 3 lugim as required in the Migdash, he did it bachutz. Or there's Nisuch Hamayim, which is on Sukkos, and Nisuch Hamayim on Sukkos requires again Shlosha Lugim minimum of Mayim, and he took the 3 Lugim of Mayim and he brought them bachutz. How do we know in all these cases that he's chayev kares for halos chutz? Again, you have to add here, which I thought the Dov Pasha, I didn't even think he would bother with such a footnote, that we're talking about mayim that was already placed into a klisharis and therefore was niskadesh. I mean, obviously, if I take mayim from my my local faucet and I pour 3 lugim on the Evid, I'm not chayiv halos chutz. Talmud Lomar vel Pesach Oel Moed Lo Yevienu. Okay, so why does the Torah have to emphasize that you're chayav for halos chutz because you didn't bring it Pesach Oel Moed, to tell you that kol abol Pesach Oel Moed chayav olam b'chutz? This is a ribui to include anything that would be subject to the proper, valid, shall we say, El Pesach Oel Moed offering. Pesach Oel Moed meaning in the Beis Hamikdash, and he took it outside the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, now we have another long list, which is even longer, of Kodshim Psulim. And we've already seen in our Mishnah an introduction, a background. The Mishnah said, Echad Kodshim Kshem, Echad Kodshim Psulim. But again, there was a qualification. So we'll have to see. How do we have a scriptural source to teach us that even if you are mala bachutz kodshim psulim, and you would say that since it's not royal pesach moed, therefore you're not chayev? No, you're chayev. How do we know this? And here's the long list. Kigon, number 1, halon, right? There's a psulina if you leave the carbon overnight instead of putting it on top of the mizbeach, and then hayotzi took it outside of the mizbeach, outside of the azor, and it's posel midin yotze. Tameh, let's say the basar, the kodesh, became tameh, it contracted tuma, a sheretz fell on it. Shenishcha chutzes mano chutzim koma, at the time the shchita had a machshav of chutzes mano chutzim koma. Chutzes mano is what we call pigul, and chutzim koma is just a psul in the carbon. Another case, shekiblu psulim. Let's say a Kohen Balmum was makabel adam, or was zorik as adam. Now, it could be even a non-Kohen would come under this category. Oh, Hanitonu Lamato, Shenas Lamal, we said there was a Chukas Sikra, that's like a belt around the middle of the Mizbeach, and there's certain korbanos that need Hazoya under the chut, on the bottom part, some on the top, and he switched it around. Oh, there's certain karbanos that have to be brought on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, and instead he went into the Heichal and he brought the carbon on the Mizbach HaKtores, or otherwise known as Mizbach HaZov, on the inside of the Heichal, or the opposite, Shenitonim Bachutz, Shenosim Bifnim, Hanitonim Bifnim, Shenosim Bachutz. Upesach v'chatos shechatan shalol lishma. We said all korbanos that you shech shalol lishman are kosher, just all the Bible Shem Chova. However, the exceptions are chatos or pesach shalol lishman is passes the carbon. Minayin, how do I know in all the cases that we listed here, which is like an overview of Maseches Zevachim, that you be chayv lo b'chutz, Talmud lo lo yivienu la'asos. So the key word here is la'asos. La'asos means that you could have done an asiyah inside the Kodesh, even though the carbon is possible. But instead of doing that, asiyah, you took it out of the Mikdash and you amaled on a Mizbeach. And that's the word lasos that's coming to be marbe kol hamiskabel pesach ol moed chayovin ala bachutz. Anything that's even if it's invalid and it's a disqualified carbon, but you could bring it inside the old moed, and if you chay for chutz. So Rashi gives two pshatim here. Let's see if we can find the Rashi. Rashi says, Dibra Masu Minayin L'Rabos Psulim, Im Alu Lo Yerdu. So we had a long discussion way back when, and it came up a few times in Maseches Zevachim, that Kodshim Psulim, if the carbon became puzzle, and you had no right to put it up on the Mizbeach, but somebody went ahead and did so, then Lo Yerdu. Then it becomes Lechem Shel Migdosh and Shel Mizbeach, and we have to burn it on the Mizbeach. So anything like that is considered as if it's royal lepesach moed. So let's look at the Rashi. Tamaloma lasos. Mashma ru'uim lasos afilu eno roy lovo chutz michutz lifnim. For hochinami. So eno roy, Rashi's bothered by this because you're not allowed to take it from the outside back into the inside. Like, let's say, for example, it was yotze, so it's possible. The halacha doesn't say to you, bring it back in. But nevertheless, kevan dim olu lo yardu. So that's Rashi's first shot. Therefore, it's royal pesach moed. There's asiyah. Asiyah means that in event that he brought it on the mizbech, he does an asiyah, meaning lo yardu, but rather he burns it on the mizbech. But Rashi gives a second shot. Lafoch behen betzinor. Oh, so we have to add another point over here. What's the asiyah? So the answer is that once it was taken up to the mizbeach, and now he has to burn it, he's got to use a poking stick, which is called a tzinora. If I'm not mistaken, it was made of metal, and he's got to poke it so that it gets burnt on all sides. That's how look in general, and it applies even here. Im olulo yerdu. Oh, Rashi says la loson mi rosh hamizbech lamarocha. There's another asiyah over here that on the mizbeach there was a marocha. That's the pyre that that's where they burnt the emurim. So once he brought the kodshim psulim, like let's say chutz machshavas shchita chutz limkomo, and it was brought up to the mizbech, now he has to do an asiyah to take it from the place on the mizbech and put it on the pyre, on the eish. The Mishnah says hamala kizayis mina ola, right, and the ola could be a combination of the emurim and the basar in order to make up a kizayis. So the Gemara is medayik. Ola ve'emurim in, shlama ve'emurim lo. What about the basar of carbon shlamim? Can that be mashlim the shear of kizayis if he's mala bachutz, not only the emurim that have to be burnt on the inside, but he added to the emurim the basar, and he did this sacrifice outside the mikdash. Tanina lahad Torah rabbanon ola ve'emurim mitztarfen kizayis also bachutz. And we're going to have to see what that means, pigul, nosar, and tameh. And we're going to say the following, that the only time you chayf halol chutz in a combination of A plus B equals a kizayis, that's only the ola meaning the basar ola and the emur. And Bishlam, I understand halas ola de kol in shlomim lo. I understand why if he took the basar of the shlomim and he added it to the emurim and the calculation total volume of the combination thereof was exercise. He's not chayav. Why isn't he chayav for Allah? Because the basar of shlomim is not to be burnt on the mizbeach. The basar of the ola is to be burnt on the mizbeach, and therefore it's mitzvah to be mashal b'kasais in the case of the emurim of the ola, because basically everything's burnt, whether it's the emurim or the basar. But in the case of shlomim, if he were to add to the emurim to be mashal b'kasais the basar is not burnt on the mizbeach. You're only chayf Allah and chutz on that which requires, if everything is equal, that you burn it on the mizbeach. Fine, but the brisa continued and says yechai mishum pigel nosa v'tamei ela pigel nosa v'tamei my timer. If let's say he had the Kohen at the time of the Shechita of the Korban had a machsheves chutz lizmana, so that makes it into pigel. Or if he left the basar, the Korban, past the allotted time, that makes it into nosar. And if he eats pigel, he's chayiv kares. If he eats nosar, he's chayiv kares. And tame, let's say, okay, tame is only a lav, but you're not allowed to, you're not allowed to eat the basar tame if the kodshim tmeim. And now he took all these situations, these scenarios of pigel, nosar, and tame, and he burnt it outside of the mikdash in a personal altar that he constructed. And he was mala b'chutz, he's chayev. Why is he chayev? For Tanan, we have a mishnah called pigul mitztarfin on nosrim, hanosarim mitztarfin. Right, we have a mishnah that says that if you have one second, let me just sorry. Again, there's a very fundamental problem over here. We said that the meat of the shlomim is not mitztaref and it doesn't integrate into the emurim to render a kazais for the chiyuv valos chutz. So the meat of the shlomim is excluded. Now you're going to tell me, and this applies even to shlomim, that if you have pigul nosar atame, then it's mitztaref. I don't get it. If the basar of shlomim is not mitztaref, why should the pigul nosar atame be mitztaref? Is kasha pigul a pigul, kasha nosar a nosar? I don't know why it doesn't say kasha tame a tame as well. So let me just read to you the footnote here, because I think he adds a very important point over here. The brisa implies that the meat and emurim of shlomim do not integrate to create a kazayis to be chayiv alos chutz. The Mishnah, on the other hand, rules that all pigul and nosar foods, which would include the shlomim, so you have pigul and nosar, which are the basar or emurim. Well, in a certain sense, there's no difference really between basar and emurim once it became nosar. But in any event, the nosar will combine with the carbon that's possible to create a kazayas, and yechayev halos chutz. So the Gemara answers, Pigul Pigul lo kasha. How do we reconcile the apparent contradiction between Pigul and Pigul? Kan bepigul, kan b'machsheves pigul. If a person eats the emurim and the basar of shlamim after it became pigul, when the Kohen had a machshav chutz lizmano, and the total volume of the two, the meat and the emurim, equals a kezayis, then he's chayav. And that's called kan bepigul. The Bryce, on the other hand, is talking about machsheves pigul. That means the basar of the pigul is not mitzvah. It's only machsheves pigul. So I guess he had a machsheves pigul on a half a kezayis of basar, and he had a machsheves pigul on a half a kezayis of emurim. The two machshavos are mitzdarfos. No. What did I just say? Oh, kan pigul. And since both the basar and the emurim have a chal shem iser pigul, therefore they're mitztarif. It's one iser made up of two parts. But in the case of machsheves pigul, you have to have machsheves pigul either for a kezayis of basar chutz mano, or a machsheves pigul for a kezayis of emurim chutz mano. Nosar lo kasha. Kan v'nosar. Apparently, Gemara is going to use the same logic, right? That if he eats nosar, what difference does it make whether he's eating the nosar of the basar or he's eating the nosar of the murim? It's all one cheft, one entity of nosar, and whether it's basar or murim, it generates a chiv karis of nosar, so that can combine together. But kanshen nisosru ajlo nizruk adam. The Bryce is talking out of a case, not where he consumes the nosar, which was made up of basar and emurim, but rather creating nosar, meaning leaving it over. Just excuse me for 1 minute. So sorry, I'm just trying to. So again, we saw that kan kisheni tosru ad shelo nizrak adam, right, where the basar and the emurim became nosar before the zrika, which is very interesting how that happened, but it became before zrika. So now there's halacha that nosar is only generated after zrika. In other words, what's nosar? Nosar means that the carbon is ready for hakrava, haktora, I should say, of the murim. It's ready for the achilas abasar because the zrikas adam was done. I mean, the zrikas adam is the culmination and the clincher. So without zrikas adam, there's no nosar. Now we're in a bind over here because in order to do zrika, you need at least the zrika has to be matir the basar, and you need at least a kizayis worth of basar. Umani Rav Yeshua this Sanya we learned to the Bryce. Rav Yeshua Omer called Zevachim Shabbat Torah, right? Any zevach where you have a combination of basar and emurim, and now there were parts of the basar or parts of the emurim that were destroyed. They were completely burnt, or they got lost, or they became tameh. Shenishtayr mehen kizayis basar. As long as what's left in the basar after the rest of the basar was lost, here we turn Talmud Beis, is a kizayis chelev. Right? So he has left over at least from the chelev, which has to be burnt on the mizbech. He has one kizayis left. So even though if the basar was gone, then he could do his rikas adam for that chelev that has a kizayis. then Zorikas Adam. Not only that, but according to Rabbi Yeshua, if he has Chatzi Zayis Basar and Chatzi Zayis Chelev, no, it's not all the Basar was destroyed, so he's left with a Shirayim of a half a Zayis worth of Basar, plus he has a half a Zayis worth of Chelev. And you might think that in such a case we can integrate the Chatzi Zayis of Chelev with the Chatzi Zayis of Basar and then do the Zrika. Eino Zorik es Adam. According to Rabbi Yeshua, you can't do a combination. These things don't combine. You can't have a half a zayis of a murim and a half a zayis of basar to combine, and then be machshir the zrika. And the only exception to that rule is ola, which makes sense because in ola everything is burnt on the spec. So it doesn't matter whether it's a chatzi zayis of basar or a chatzi zayis of a murim. They're both equal in the eyes of the law because they both go up in smoke on the marach of the mizbech. Chatzi zayis basar, chatzi zayis chelev, zorik es adam, it neshe kulo kolil. Uvemincha filu kulo kayemes lo yizrok. In any event, what is the underlying basis here of Rabbi Yeshua? He's saying that if you have a kizayis in the case of a korban shlomim, I'm not talking about ola now, and that kizayis is a combination of a half a zayis of basar and a half a zayis of a murim, then since it's a case of shlomim, we can't combine the two, and there's no zrikas adam. So if he's the author of the Brisa, and the Brisa says that if you have a kazayas worth of volume made up of these two parts, it will never become nosar. And the reason why it never become nosar is because according to Rabbi Yeshua, you can never do the zrika. And nosar by definition is when the karba was allowed to go beyond its allotted time after the zrika. But here there's no zrika. Because you can't do zrika because all you have is a half a size of basa, half a size of a murim, and they chelev or a murim, and they can't be combined. So now mincha maya vidite. What's going on over here? This whole discussion about combining a half a size with a half a size was about the zrikas adam, but in mincha there is no zrikas adam. Omer papa minchas nisachim aboim azevach. Right. So there were certain nisachim libations that were brought to accompany a korban. And with regard to those libations, the zrika of the korban has an impact on the nisuch hayayit. And he points out here in the footnote that a minchas nesachim, which is offered as an accompaniment to a mincha, to a zevach, those minchos are either 3 esronim of flour, 6 lugim of oil in the case of a par, 2 esronim, 4 lugim in a case of an ayil, 1 isaron and 3 lugim in the case of a keves, and the minchas nesachim is burnt entirely on the mizbeh. And now what we're saying is that the zrika of the dam has an impact on the nesachim, on the nesach, on the yayin that you use for nisuch. And that leads us to the Mishnah here on Kuf Tes Amid Beis. Okay, then, so we'll stop here and